are they, she, her, them, and I was born here in South Dakota, and I created South Dakotans Healing Racism um, during the Ferguson uprising in 2014. I'm really grateful that in 2019, I had a lot of support join in doing the community education work, really centered in peer-to-peer kind of conversation, growth, and education around race and racism, primarily just focused on white folks, because not being able to talk about race, not being able to talk about racism really was keeping us from being able to do any of the work at all. So we've done a lot of that work, and we're excited for this year for expanding and shifting a little bit. And at the beginning of this year, we announced that we will be doing that examination of some intertwined aspects of the human spirituality within religion, and how systemic racism and white toxicity really have impacted our divine interconnection. And that takes, many different forums. We're excited about having different guest speakers, and we're really, really honored to begin with a guest speaker from one of the only churches in Sioux Falls here that I know of that has an Indigenous-centered service every week. So as we gather here via Zoom, I'm not sure if everybody on the call here is in South Dakota, but in South Dakota, the land is Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota land. Some of you may know, but some may not, that just miles outside of Sioux Falls, there is now a state park that's called Mazo Udo Mayapi, or Good Earth, and it's a 1,000 of years old kind of historic trading site. I do want to remind, especially the white folks on the call, that as white settlers, we are at very best the guests on this land, and at worst acknowledging that there's that violent occupation that's occurring here. I think as the Episcopal Church in Sioux Falls has demonstrated with their support of preserving Lakota language and culture, providing a place for Indigenous people to worship, and community support via things like the Native American Day Parade, there are ways of working towards weaving a reality that honors and creates that community for us together. Being able to face that truth of our history is something that really allows us to have like a shared understanding to move forward. Reverend Shanika Broken Leg is the staff officer for racial reconciliation at the Episcopal Church, as a member of the presiding bishop staff. She is currently in Sioux Falls here, which we're really lucky to have her here, but she is from Rosebud Reservation, where she's enrolled. As always, we'll provide opportunities for questions at the end of the call. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and go around and do introduction. We're going to go ahead. We've got a couple of questions that we've prepared for Reverend Shanika as we have this conversation. We're going to take turns asking those. And then at the end, if you all have questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat as we go. We do have this as an hour tonight. We do try and make space for anybody who wants to hang out during the call. And then if you haven't signed up already for our email mailing list, you can go ahead and put that into the chat as well, or just email us at the SDAR community@gmail.com, and we can get you added on there for upcoming events. So I think the first question, was it Zach, were you going to go ahead and do that for, or Serene? Serene's our first question.
Thank you. So the first question, I'm just kind of going to take you back in the day and ask you, what was your relationship with religion growing up, and how has it changed now?
That's a good question. I think like growing up, there are lots of different sort of religious pieces. Like, so I'm mixed. I'm half white and half Lakota, and on the Indian side, my grandpa was an Episcopal priest, my uncle was an Episcopal priest, and then they were Orthodox Christian, like Greek Orthodox Christian for a little while. And on the white side, we had like Lutherans, and then we have other relatives who were very like traditional Lakota spirituality, which we did too. We didn't like Sundance, but we would do other things. And I think now, how has it changed? I think now I have like a greater understanding of kind of my own belief system, where I sort of feel like I fit within those contexts. And I think that often that space as a, I'm in Lakota language, is what's called a wink day. It's a third gender. So we walk between the worlds of the masculine and feminine and natural and supernatural. And I feel like as a mixed person, I also walk between like the white world and the Lakota world, and the Christian world and the traditional Lakota spirituality world, and the lay and the ordained world. And so I kind of feel like part of my call as it relates to religion is to think about reconciliation, and how are we reconciled to one another, and trying to think of how to explain it in a more concrete way. In Lakota, we have a word that says wo Lakota, and that is the state when all things are in right relationship with one another. So when like we are in right relationship with each other, when we are in right relationship with the creator, when we are in right relationship with creation, and when we are in right relationship with ourselves. And I think that is sort of what I'm called to do. And I think that's what we're called to do as people. And the reason why our name is Lakota is because we're the people who are trying to get to that space of right relationship. Other people will tell you it translates to friends, but it's deeper than that.
All right, thank you for that. The second question, you talked about kind of being in between worlds. So following that, how has race and or racism impacted your life as a child and as an adult? I imagine, you know, being like a kind of like a third culture person or third culture kid, kind of trying to find your own identity at times. So just, you know, how has race and racism impacted your life as a child and as an adult?
That's a really, we could be here all like for 2 weeks. I think
No.
for me, as a child, I could see how racism impacted my brown relatives, the native ones, in terms of their interactions with the police, in terms of how we were treated when we would go to some of the different towns. Like when you live on the reservation, you almost always have to go shopping at the border towns. And I think like Sioux Falls and Rapid City are like the big ones, right? But then like if you're in Rosebud, you'll either go to Winter or Valentine. And so you see how we get treated in those towns. And I think there's a lot of things we learned growing up, you know, like make sure if you touch something that the people see you put it back on the shelf. Don't ever like reach into your pocket. There's all of these other rules that I didn't have to learn, that the white side of my family never talked about, I guess. And they got treated differently in their interactions. And I think I also saw the like effects of generational trauma in the communities, the poverty, the substance use, the struggles that people have, and the I'm going to call it dysfunction, like the social dysfunction, or those pieces that you see. And I think on the white side, I really struggled with, they tried to make me the exception. So they'll talk about in general, and they'll be like, well, you know, they'll say racist things, and then they will say, oh, but you're not one of those. You're here with us in our community. And that's their way of trying to be nice, but it was actually very hurtful. And so I think in some ways you sort of belong to both of those groups, and in some ways you don't belong to any of them, really depending on how people are. And the other thing I think that's really impactful as a child that I remember is when something bad happens, even if you can't control it, if you say that it's okay, if you don't say that it's not okay, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. When something happened, my white relatives wouldn't say anything. When someone used the N-word or somebody did anything, that tells me that behavior is okay, or at least it's socially acceptable. Whereas even if they couldn't control it, something bad happened, they could say that's not how you're supposed to treat a woman, or that's not how you're supposed to treat a person of color, or whatever. And I think that that's something I noticed as a child. As an adult, the way I saw racism, aside from the standard things that everybody thinks of, was in my professional life. Before I became a priest, I was an epidemiologist, and I worked for the tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And so there's 34 tribes there and 4 urban Indian areas that we served. And when we would do research, the way that the outside academics viewed our research was always with this skepticism, and that like it wasn't good enough, it wasn't right, they didn't trust our numbers. Like we, let's give an example, we did a survey of the American Indian youth in the state of Wisconsin. We had over 1,800 surveys, so end of 1,800. And when we came out, our rate showed that our kids smoked and used tobacco at a much higher rate than what they thought. And it's much higher than the white kids. And they totally didn't believe us. And then when somebody pointed out, I was like, well, how many people did you survey to get your number? They surveyed 45 that they had to collapse over 3 years, which meant on average, they only asked 15 Indian kids about their smoking behavior. And they're relying on that data, those data more, or weighting that more importantly than 1,800 students. And so it's things like that where you always get second guessed, or you always are treated like you don't know what you're doing. And I think the other place I noticed was maybe academically, when you're in school, I think that's really difficult. And I don't know exactly how it comes, but I feel like sometimes you feel like you don't belong there when you're in school, because they're not, your education is not meant to teach you anything. It's really there to indoctrinate you into whatever system you're there to end up doing. And so both when I went to grad school for public health, I was usually the only person of color in my class. And so you have, but public health is a lot about working with health disparities. So mostly you're going to be working in communities of color, and they're teaching you how to become this white savior. That's what they teach the students to do. And to go in there and try and tell them how to live their life. And like, no, that's not what you do. It's always about relationships. It's always about building relationships as you do this work, but that's not necessarily what they were teaching. And so I'd get bumped up against it. And same thing in seminary, they're trying to form you into what you need to be. Like, in order to be a priest, there's certain skills you should have. But at the same time, there's this whole other thing that they're indoctrinating you into that they're not even aware of. All of those little pieces that they're trying to teach you. And it's sort of like to make you white, if that makes sense. Well, it doesn't make sense, but I mean, it happens. So I think in my adult life, that's where I see that.
Thank you so much, Reverend Shanika. I really appreciate that in-depth answer. So the next question is, how do you see an intersection of your relationship with religion and your experiences with race and racism?
Yeah. Well, I think there's tons of intersections just in the history of our country. I don't want to give you a big, long history lesson, but there was a time when a lot of the mainline churches split over slavery and over segregation. We officially did not split as the Episcopal Church, but we did, and we just didn't say we did. I know like the Methodist split and they later came back together. Now they're about to split again over LGBT stuff. But so sometimes when things come up, people made decisions, and people made, in my opinion, the wrong decisions that didn't treat us as we are all related, decisions that treated us differently. In South Dakota, well, actually in all of North America, but Grant's peace policy back in the day actually doled out religious denominations to the different reservations. A lot of people aren't aware of that, but they did. And so it sort of was like, okay, Rosebud, you're going to be Episcopalian, so-and-so, you're going to be Catholic, you're going to be Methodist, you're going to be Lutheran, you're going to be Dutch Reformed, you're going to be Quaker. And that's sort of what happened. Later on, a lot of those denominations had to pull out because they didn't know what they were doing. And then they put in the big three were Catholic, Quaker, and Episcopalian. And so you'll see a lot of times which reservation has the majority of the people. Well, guess which one mine was Episcopalian. You'll see that displayed. at the same time, our church has done amazing things to help and build real relationships. So after the Dakota conflict, 1862, our bishop rode all the way down to talk to Abraham Lincoln and demanded that they retry, get new trials for all of the 350 Dakota people who were sentenced to death. And by doing that, he saved the lives of several hundred. And so instead they hung 38 people instead of 350 some. I think what I noticed growing up is there's sometimes this idea of religion, and I specifically talk about Christianity here, as being sort of, are you the model that's going to be exclusionary, like you're there to guard the faith kind of thing, or are you there to sort of help and support and build relationships with people and sort of build, quote unquote, God's kingdom, if you want to call it that. And you see how those two churches will look, and you can go, like if you go to churches in Sioux Falls or anywhere in South Dakota, you'll see the model that they come from sometimes by how they engage and interact with folks. I think growing up, our church was always accepting. I was taught from little kid when I was helping pass out communion, whoever comes up to that communion rail, you give them communion, don't matter what they look like, what they're wearing, if they're drunk, you give them communion because that's not your decision. You're not God. You're only there like the spoon to help feed them. And when I would travel with my grandparents, we'd sometimes go to other churches, and we would usually sit in the back. And I could see how we got treated, the looks that people gave us when we'd walk in as this brown family. And I think I'm going to cry if I tell the story, but I'm going to try not to. One time we couldn't sit in the back and we sat up in the middle because that was where the space was available. And when we went up for communion, everybody that was behind us in line went to the other side. Like they didn't want to take communion after us. And I remember trying to ask my grandma why, like, were we dirty? Did we have a disease? Why is this church that's supposed to say that God loves everybody wouldn't, like, why would they treat us that way? And so I think the church can be this powerful tool of reconciliation, but it can be also this powerful tool of perpetuating hate. And it does both.
Thank you so much. I really think you touched on it a little bit, that how does racism impact Native experiences with religion? Thinking of that recent example in the national park where I believe Daryl House, who is Native, was assaulted by a park ranger while hiking there, and then the legacy of having Native religious rites and cultural practices outlawed. How did that impact, or how do you see that impacts with the experiences with religion? I like how you said at the end of the last question, the powerful tool for reconciliation or the perpetration. So how does that fit in with those things as well?
Yeah, I think the best way I can imagine, I don't know how many of you, what religions you all are, if anything, but like for traditional folks, we're tied to the earth, and the different places that we pray, like our sacred spaces, are places that are different, have different stories to us. They tell us different things, like Wind Cave, for example. In our creation story, that's where we came out of the ground. That's where we came onto this earth. And so it's a very sacred space for us, and yet they just took dynamite and blasted a big hole in it and put an elevator in there so people can go up and down in there and the cave. And it'd be like, if we went into some big cathedral and blasted a hole in the side so people could come and gawk at everything in there. I don't think people see how that connection works. And I don't know what to say other than it's wrong that we treat the sacred site of people in that way. Both, like, quote unquote Devil's Tower, people climb on it all the time, and that's one of the big no-nos. That's a very sacred site too, and all the different ways that gets treated, and how dare you prevent somebody from praying. I did think it's kind of interesting. I went to Bear Butte, which is another sacred site in the Black Hills, and if you start to walk up the trail, there's like this little sign on the side of like things you might encounter on the trail. And there's like a picture of a rattlesnake, and there's a picture whatever, and there's a picture of an Indian person praying. And I was like, great, we're like listed with the flora and fauna of the thing. On the one hand, I mean, it is kind of bad, but on the other hand, I think it's important because, like, when I go to Wind Cave, for example, if I go there and I'm going to pray, I'll bring my tobacco and I'll say my prayer, but then people are always gawking, or, they don't know what to do. And so sometimes you have to kind of let them know. Actually, during COVID, I went with a friend and we went camping up there, and her and I went to Wind Cave and it was closed, like you couldn't go inside. So we went to the site and we were praying. It was just this wonderful interaction of these two, I think one was South Asian and one was Asian. Women, and they were there. And when my friend was praying, I just sort of leaned over because they were coming. I was like, just hold on a moment, she's praying. And then I explained, when you go to the Wind Cave, when it's sucking air in, that means that Mother Earth needs our prayers. And when it's blowing, that means that she's praying for us. And so we can pray and ask for things. And so I kind of told them what was going on and explained what we were doing. And then I asked them if they wanted to pray too. And so I gave them each tobacco, and they prayed with us there. And of course, I don't know what they were praying for because it was private. But I just thought that was an interesting moment and of time to be together and time to think about those things that we need. I hope that one other thing. So I'm going to just share one other thing. With Christianity, a long time ago, like way back in the Bible, in Paul's time, who wrote all those letters and the epistles, the question that people would ask was, must one become a Jew before one can become a Christian? That was the question. You read about that in Paul's letter, and Paul will say, no. He won't say that. He'll say, must you be circumcised before you become a Christian? And his answer is no, that's not a requirement. You can become Christian without being Jewish. Somehow, when people came from Europe over to North America, they somehow forgot that, and they thought that you must become white. That, I think, was the question they thought when they came over here. You must be white before you can become a Christian. And so they took all of these things that we as Lakota people or other indigenous folks use, and they wanted to get rid of it all. And what I like to tell people is, Jewish people had their own creation story, their own ceremonies, all of those things. As Christians, we sometimes call it the Old Testament. It's really their Hebrew Bible. We honor that and keep that as sacred. It's in our Bible that we read, right? We Lakota people or other indigenous people, we have our own ceremonies and our creation story and all of those pieces too. That's our Bible. That's our Old Testament. So there's no reason to get rid of that because that's part of our story as well.
Oh, thank you. I think we've got one more question, and I think Laura was going to close us out with our questions there.
Thank you so much for all that. That's a perspective I hadn't thought of before. I really appreciate hearing it. The last question was, how do you see religion playing a role in anti-racism going forward?
Very good question. I think, one, it needs to play a role in anti-racism going forward. If we really, from a Lakota perspective, we believe that we are all related and we are called to be a good relative. And and not just people, but we're related to plants and animals and all of creation. If you really believe that, then you cannot treat others badly. And I think as Christians, we might think of it as beloved community. How are we building beloved community? What I always tell people in our creation story, it says that, God created everyone and God says that it was good, which means that as human beings, we are inherently good. God sees us as good. God loves us. You will never look into the eyes of someone that God does not love. And I think so often different groups of people look into the eyes of another and fail to see that, fail to know that, fail to recognize that piece. And so I remember having a conversation with somebody who said that they were talking with the fancy people in like Wall Street and stuff, and they were concerned about the fractured nature of our society right now, and how they were trying to fix that. And the person was like, we are hoping and needing the different religions to come together and sort of work on that work of reconciliation, because that's the only place where we're going to be able to sort of hopefully melt hearts that are kind of turned to stone in some ways about some different things. And so I think for me, in my work going forward, I usually think about it in terms of how are we building relationships, because whether because I am LGBT or Winkte, whether because I'm a person of color, whatever it might be, from my experience, the way that I've been able to transform hearts, or the way that I've been able to transform someone who's racist into someone who's not racist, is through building relationships with them and being there so that they can see that whatever stereotypes they have are not true. I think that's important. If I can, I'm gonna share a couple of resources that we've developed at our church that may be helpful for you all. One is called Becoming Beloved Community. It's just an overview. It's kind of like a tool that we sort of, our philosophy we use. It's sort of this labyrinth and 4 quadrants, but it's like repair the breach, tell the truth, proclaim the dream, and something the vision. I can't remember, but there's these 4 pieces, and they all sort of the work that we have to do this reconciliation. So I put that in the chat. I'm going to share one more other thing, and this I have in English and Spanish. But we, during after George Floyd's murder and a lot of like the unrest and stuff, I was doing a lot of workshops for folks, and so we created this resource we call Pew to Public Square, and it's just got stuff of kind of like, one, why should we as Christians care about this work, and how do we do that work, and kind of just give you kind of some infographics that I think might be helpful for folks, especially for folks who are doing community organizing. I think you might like it, but it talks like, you know, building relationships with the people that you want to work with, and then helping in relationship with them, then deciding on the work that you want to do, and then some of the ways you can do that work, go about doing. So those are all in the chat. Hopefully you can use those, and hopefully they're helpful for you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate those resources, and there's so much that I learned too. You know, I've known about the Dakota 38, but I did not know about that there was that interceding on behalf of the other hundreds that had been sentenced. And I know being able to recognize that history, one of the things that the Episcopal Church here in Sioux Falls is the oldest in Sioux Falls. It's something that's been here for a very, very long time. And I definitely appreciate knowing, what was it, the grant about having the peace policy assigning different religions. That's not something that I was aware of. You know, it feels very much that kind of colonizing, and like, you know, it happened like in the Middle East and in Africa, where European countries were like just piecing things apart. So that's definitely something that's an existing thing, and but it's just not something I feel like we talk about enough. So I really appreciate you sharing things like that. And then the part of relating the beloved community with the being in right relationship, and that we're all related. I think that Wolakota, right? That's what you hit at the beginning. And I really appreciate everything that you shared here. So if anybody has questions, just go ahead, feel free to raise your hand. If we want, we can go ahead and see, just unmute yourself. And then it can be like really anything from, if you want to ask Reverend Shanika or other folks, or just share some of your thoughts. And that's definitely something that's welcome here.
Let me share my screen for just a moment, and I will show you just this. This is just a map. I'm happy to send it to you. I don't have it. Actually, I could put it in the chat. I have to find it, but I can put it in the chat for you. This is just a map that lays out originally where what denomination was given to which reservation back in the day. So you can see them. I'll put that in the chat so you can see. But it was President Grant and his peace policy, which originally was, the goal was to, so the Indian agents were bad, most of them, and would like take money away and do naughty things, and we wouldn't get paid, or we wouldn't be fed, or we wouldn't be housed. And that's kind of what caused the Minnesota conflict. And the idea was that, well, if we make religious people the Indian agents, because religions never do anything wrong, then that will solve this problem. And that's sort of how that happened. I can put that map in the chat.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's definitely interesting. And then I don't know if everyone saw too, so the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, that didn't pass until 1978. So up until that point, indigenous religious and spiritual traditions were outlawed in the country. So.
I have a question for you, Reverend Shanika. So I've been thinking about it since you said it in the answer to the first question of that walking between worlds. And I guess I don't wish to speak for anyone else, but just having conversations with different people like who do find themselves in those different worlds, like really struggling with feeling like nobody wants them, nobody's claiming them fully. Is that something you ever felt in your life, or have you had to navigate those or help others navigate those, and that kind of tension, I guess?
I felt that way in my life. I think both being like mixed Lakota and white. I also felt that way when I was a teenager. I moved to Seattle with my father, and he kicked me out of the house. So I was homeless for a while, and which happens to a lot of LGBT youth. And I think that was a time where I really felt alone. But I will tell you, there was a church that I would go to. They didn't know that I was homeless, but they always felt they're very welcome to me always, whether I was dressed crappy or maybe didn't smell good. Whatever it was, they always were very good to me. I think what I learned and what I learned growing up about that Wink Day role is that we're called to be servants of the community, and so we are there to, traditionally we would be healers, spiritual, physical, emotional healers. We often are called to pray. That's actually what ended up having me go back to school to become a priest. So people in the community where I was working in Wisconsin, the Indian community there, they were having me do people's funerals, and they were having me do all these things, and I was like, wait a minute, what's going on? And that's kind of what ended up happening. And I think traditionally those were some of the things that we did, and I think for me, I try and live that out in my life. I'm not really answering your question, sorry. And then I think the other thing I was going to say about that, like my Lakota name is the same as my grandpa's, and his name was Tokala Ehake, which means the last, well, sort of like last warrior, but it really means the last member of the warrior of the specific warrior society. And it's the person who stays behind in the battle to get away. And I think what helped me gain strength and when I felt like I was alone was calling back onto my traditional things and the things that I remember hearing from my grandparents who were very, very loving. And the things that they taught me, sometimes I hear my grandma's voice in my head and not like schizophrenically, but just, hear it in the head. And she would tell me, like things like you're strong, remember that you have you're here for a reason, you're called to heal the community, those kind of things. And so instead of coming out, you might think of it as coming in, where like you're coming into your community in that role as the Wink Day, and then they're there to use you, not in a bad way, but use you as they need.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that perspective. I like that coming in rather than coming out, and coming into your own, really.
I just want to comment on the theme of reconciliation, which has just been like all over my life this past year, and I just keep hearing about it, and I love hearing about reconciliation in people's lives, and what you said about how God, what did you say about God doesn't, God, whoever God is looking in the eyes, like God loves everybody, you know what I'm saying? And we forget that. And kind of like there's reconciliation in that of accepting that, we, it's hard. And I'm not very I'm not in organized religion at all, and I haven't been since I was younger. And that's always kind of a theme that seems to be forgotten. And it seems like people don't want to reconcile with that part of their religion. And I mean, how do you see best to help people recognize reconcile with that? If God looks into everybody's eyes and loves all of us, how do we find that in ourselves and in each other?
Very good question. That's the hard question, right? Because sometimes let me just say it's something that I struggle with. There are times when, there's someone filled with hate, or someone like, how do you acknowledge them in a way that their full humanity? Sometimes what I try and do is just take a step back, take a breath, and take a time. Other times it's like trying to figure out. But part of, I think, reconciliation, you'll see this a lot on Facebook, people are talking right now. You can't just move from this fractured area to unity. Reconciliation is the process by which we make the relationship right again, right? So that also includes acknowledging the wrongs that have been done. That also includes all of those other pieces of forgiveness and all of that stuff. So you can't just go from here to here. You kind of have to, work your way over. For me, what I've tried to do when I've really struggled with somebody that's different from me is I've usually tried to have a conversation with them and just kind of get to some root piece. What I find helpful is to ask people, which actually that's a whole other thing our church just launched too. It's called From Anyone, and there's these conversations, and there are 4 questions. What have you lost? What do you love? I'm going to forget the rest. Something like, what do you care about? I'll find it and put it in the chat. But it's these series of conversations. So usually for me, I kind of ask, like, what's on your heart right now? What's keeping you up at night? And from there, you can find, like, if you ask that question to, let's say we got a bunch of Democrats and Republicans and whatever in there, we ask them that question, you will find common themes throughout. I'm worried about my family. I'm worried about how my children are going to be. Are they going to be safe? And they might be coming at it from 2 different spaces, and they think the answer to how to keep the children safe is 2 different things, but they're both coming from that grounded, rooted space of caring about their children or whatever it might be, which is why over history, so many people use children as a way to get people riled up about something. So like when they used to say Jews would eat your children, they used to say gay people will molest your children. I think people still say that. All these different, the gypsies would take your children. Those are all tools people use because when we're worried about our children, we can't think straight. And so that gets us from a logical place where we can be objective to an illogical emotional place where it's harder to be objective. That's one of the tools that folks will use. I'm going way off track, I'm sorry. Somebody asked in the chat, is the creator in American Indian spiritual culture assigned a masculine identity? Which is a great question. One of the interesting things about Lakota language is we do not have pronouns. So people always ask, like, what are your pronouns? I'm like, we don't have pronouns in the Lakota language, but men speak differently than women. And they use different like endings to words. Men say yellow a lot or yedo or whatever. Women will say e or a or ah and they end their sounds. And so if the Jewish people had been Lakota and God spoke to them and they had written it down, you would know God's gender. And my guess is God would use both gender endings. But in the language, I've heard female words used for God, like grandmother, like kumshi and unchi. And then I've also heard another metaphor for God is tumkashila, which literally means grandfather. It's the same word you would use to address your grandfather. And then I've also, we have words like Wakantanka, which just means like the big, powerful, mysterious thing, or the great spirit, or the holy mystery, or powerful mystery. It can mean a lot of different things, and that's gender neutral. And then there's another word that I learned growing up. My grandma's like, this word, the word for God is so sacred that we don't use it very often. And she told me what it was, but apparently it was so sacred and we used it so infrequently that I have forgotten what it is. But that one was also gender neutral.
Well, thank you. We've got about 5 minutes, so we definitely have time for more questions. And we have no problem. If everybody consents to sticking around a little bit longer, we can definitely go over as well. You know, there is no right or wrong questions, and being able to, you know, just share your thoughts and perspectives is definitely something that's really welcome.
I was wondering, like, when did you know that you wanted to be a reverend? Like, how old were you? Or did you have some other big lofty dream? Like, what did you want to be when you grow up?
I used to think I wanted to be a doctor. I used to think I want to be an astronaut. There's all the things, you know, all the things kids think about. When I was little, I used to play priest, but I think that's just because my grandpa and my uncle were priests. And so my cousin and I, we dressed up in his little vestments, and then we'd get yelled at because we got them dusty or whatever. But, and we would like play communion and, you know, whatever. I thought about it in college just because somebody sort of was like, I think you'd be a good priest. I'm like, oh, hell no. Well, what are you talking about? Like, anyway, and I think there was like this big resistance. And then I went through like thinking about it. And then in Wisconsin, because of all these things that were going on, like people were asking me to preach at the church and do these different things. And I had to take a step back and be like, really think about it. And in Lakota culture, we have this thing called Hamblecha, which means like crying for a vision or a vision quest. That's kind of like a time to like center yourself and recalibrate one's stuff. And I think of Lent, which we're about to go into soon. Lent is a time for doing that. It's time for us to sit down and try and reconnect with the sacred and find out, you know, where have we gone wrong? Where can we go? Where is God sending us? And in doing that, that's how that came about. I was like, okay, if this is really what's meant to happen, I will let go and see what happens. And then I had to quit my job and go to school and move, and it was a lot of stuff, but it, you know, but it's what was needed. And I'm glad I made that decision. It was scary and I was afraid. But one of the Lakota virtues is bravery, which doesn't mean you're not afraid. I mean, doing what you need to do, even if you are afraid. And I think another one that I've been leaning on a lot this time with COVID and everything going on in our society is another one that means fortitude is another one of our, basically bravery, fortitude, wisdom, and generosity are like the four that I was always taught. And so I think about those.
I guess it's not exactly a question that I have, but more of a thank you for bringing something to my attention. I grew up in Pierre, South Dakota here, which is, I guess, technically what you would consider to be not necessarily a border town, but between Sioux Falls and Rapid City, a little bit further off the interstate. But not only is there a strong Indigenous peoples presence in Pierre itself, but a lot of the peoples of the reservations would come into Pierre for Walmart groceries and everything like that. And so as a child growing up, I went to school with, I'd never, how do I say this? I'm so sorry. This is my first meeting. I'm trying to be careful, so I apologize if I offend at all. I never looked at my Indigenous friends, my Native friends, as different than me, because the ratio in Pierre was pretty high versus here in Sioux Falls. In Pierre, we did not have many people of color other than Caucasian or Indigenous peoples. They have a boarding school there. And the Pure Indian Learning Center is what it was called then. I don't know what it's called now, unfortunately. And there was, Lakota actually offered at the high school. So I thought myself to be relatively aware of what was going on in PIERRE, but I honestly never thought of something as simple as you being a child going to the grocery store and having to think about that. Because I remember being able to walk through the grocery store eating grapes right out of the bag, or grabbing a handful of peanuts at Sutley's and eating them right there. And it was never thought anything of by my parents, by the cashiers, by anything. And so I really appreciate you bringing that forward to me. It's something that I can reflect on, and for sure.
I think it's important, you know, those of you who have children and those of you who are white and have children, to help them learn about that, because like if one of their friends is a person of color there and they're out doing something, they might not realize the risks that they're putting that person of color in. Like, and for sometimes it can be life or death things. And so it's important to educate your children that, you know, you might be able to get away with eating the peanuts out of the bag, right? But then that same, you know, your friend who's brown or black could do that and they would get treated differently. I know that for me, I had to learn that with my driving. So, you know, if I give people rides sometimes, I tend to be bad and speed, and I usually get like at least one speeding ticket a year. But like my friends who are undocumented, if they're in the car, I can't do that. And I learned that the hard way. Like nobody got deported or got arrested or anything, but like the emotional impact it had on the person in the car with me, like the panic on his face and how freaked out he was and how angry he was afterwards. Like I can't do that. And I have to be cognizant of that, you know, that's a privilege that I have that this person does not.
Exactly. So I thank you for that. Honestly, that it a whole new perspective for me. So thank you.
So just time check, it is 8 o'clock. You are welcome to stay and continue the conversation. But if you only had the hour, just want to let folks know that I really appreciate you sharing that, Jess, and working through just being able to talk about it. Like there's a lot of vulnerability in that, but it's such an important thing to engage and be willing to make mistakes and be willing to be corrected too as we have these conversations. I feel like that really, Reverend Shanika, when you were talking about as a child, seeing your white relatives be silent about the issue, like really had an impact. And I think that's one of the things that's so important for white folks to realize, is that silence is violence. I have my sign from the Women's March here when we had the inauguration 4 years ago, and that's on there, that white silence is violence, because not saying something, and as simple as just like, hey, that's not okay. And like teaching our kids, I appreciate you bringing that up, because teaching them what they do can get their friends of color in trouble. But I've also I have a teenager, and talk to them about their responsibility as a white person is to like be able to be there and use that privilege in a way that you're not going to be at risk as much as your friends of color. Like, especially my 15-year-old, when they have hair, is blonde and blue-eyed, and so very much that kind of, and feminine presenting, so that there's a lot of privilege in there, and just being able to name that and what their responsibility is, it's something that's really important in being able to shift that.
Go ahead. I saw a hand raised.
So, Mother, we haven't really admitted this like on Facebook, but this last weekend, our blended family, my ex-husband, who lives also in Brookings, he moved here. So I have 4 sons, 3 of whom are biologically my ex-husband's, and then my husband, Ben, and I, we have a daughter too. We made the decision last weekend, though, after what we saw from the counter protesters during the Justice for Black Lives March, to send our children back home to stay with relatives in Cheyenne River. We just honestly, I didn't feel safe in our community. That's not something we even tried to tell our church. I was, a little bit about me. So I'm an enrolled member of the Oglala Sioux tribe. I was born in Pine Ridge. My mother's white and she's from Brookings. My father's from Pine Ridge. And we're Iesca back home too. We're mixed there as well. So I have a lot of white privilege that I'm aware of. But I've also dealt with racism as well, even though I'm fairly, passing. And so, I used to, so as a Jesus person, after, especially about the time I was received Episcopalian in my 20s, after leaving the toxic white evangelicalism, I had met the concept of the Maggio Day, right? Or what's the Christus? I can't think of it. But anyway, like God in people, to see Christ in others. There's the Saint Christos. I can't say his name, but it's, if you can't see Christ in the beggar at the church door, you won't find him in the chalice. This concept. And so I was gifted, and I just fell in love, like a love with people, and I just it was just this beautiful revelatory thing. And then it's like that left me during the Justice for Black Lives Matter, because, we're in this crowd. I was running for school board. My name is decidedly, foreign looking. I put myself out there. We're dealing with this pandemic. My son, when he graduated high school, was given an eagle feather that was taken from him during his graduation ceremony. So we had, had a petition, and we had worked with the school and done all this stuff. So anyway, and I have white family in this community, and I didn't feel safe. I can't even, it's really hard for me now to see God in these people. It's easy if they're unchika, right? Or if, and I also worked for an, organizing nonprofit where we were consensus based. So we did look for, like you're talking about, those common themes we all share. I have to admit, I'm having a hard time, and I've never been a fearful person. Maybe it's because I'm edging towards 40 and I have 5 beautiful children. But so two of our, and I also have a child with pretty severe ADHD that presents like ODD. So the idea of, if something did happen, trying to get them to listen and get into a vehicle and to leave was problematic. So, but yeah, I mean, nobody knows this about us, that we send our children, away. And, I don't even know what to do with that. I feel a little bit better since we got through the Wednesday, and nothing too terrible happened. But when they, it was on these boards about attacking liberal activists, and we helped organize our Democratic Socialists of America. And, I am part of Oak Lake Writer Society, which we also support the Red Nation. And so Indigenous socialist justice. I mean, it's, yeah. And like I said, I don't know that they would even, I don't know that churches can even handle that. Sorry, that was a mess, but.
It's not a mess. You did what you needed to do to take care of your children, right? And that's important. And I think one of the things I think that's so important, like our Episcopal Church is 90% white. Lutheran Church, ELCA, is like 94% white. We are aware that that's a problem, which is why I have a job. But I think one of the things that as white folks, if you are in whatever relationship you have with people, when the people of color tell you something, listen. And that's one of those ways that they can be allies. Like, even just listening to the heartache in your voice as you're talking about this difficult decision that you had to make, and the fear, right? I remember after Trump got elected, everybody was kind of this big fear that folks were having. And I think the white folks were just like, oh, no, not all of them, of course, but, oh, no, don't worry about it. You'll be blah, blah, blah. And like women were scared, people of color were scared, people with disabilities, like, it was just like all these things. And it's so important, at least me as a person, hearing what other people say, then I know if they're a safe person or not. If they discount my feelings and emotions, they cease to be a safe person in my mind. I know that that's not the person I'm going to go to for help. Same thing, like if you're growing up and you're a kid, you hear your parents say like faggot or whatever, those kind of things, you know that that's not a safe person. You will never tell them about your sexuality. I was scared to tell my white grandma because sorry, I'm way off track. She thought they were going to hell and stuff. And anyway, we later had a good relationship, but I was afraid. And so we listen and we hear that. And I think sometimes what I do when I try and see God in the other person, or know that God loves them, and when it's hard, is try and think of them one as Ushika. You could do that, but try and also figure out where they're coming from and kind of what that root is that they're afraid of. What is it that they're holding on to that they're afraid of? Or what it is that, like, where is that anger coming from? That's a lot harder to do for me, especially when I think they don't deserve to be angry. Like the privileged person with lots of money that's mad that, whenever they think somebody's taking their job or whatever, I'm like, really? But sometimes I'm like, well, this is terrible for me to admit, but sometimes like, they just don't get it. They're like, they've like been brainwashed to think something else. And so I can sort of see them as mistaken, which is bad because that assumes that I'm right and they're wrong, right? That's not okay either, but it's helpful at least.
I just wanted to add, that you made a good comment there, because I know I'm practicing Zen Buddhist. And so, with the whole Capitol riots, the Buddhists are arguing, not arguing, but they were saying that we have to approach them from the perspective that they, they're just, they just don't see things in a right way. They would use the term like, they're not, I know enlightened is not the best word, but that they've got, that they're grasping towards things, and we need to help them out, because Buddhists always talk about helping out all, the liberation of all beings type of thing. And so it was kind of like, you shouldn't be angry towards the racists and others, but you should realize, where they're coming from, and that they aren't liberated yet. And that,
well, that's all well and good until they have machine guns and are standing on the corner of your street and blocking and yelling at you. I mean, I lived in the middle of Cheyenne River as a single mom with a few kids, house sitting, middle of nowhere during a meth epidemic, and felt a hell of a lot safer than I did last week in Brookings, freaking South Dakota, with its manicured lawns and its this and that and whatever. Like, that's what I'm talking about. It's like, I have a quote, like, was it Madeline L'Engle, if you're going to help the sparrow, remember everyone's a sparrow. Yeah, great, until they have a gun. That's what I'm saying, is like, these are people that are, armed and dangerous, literally, like, and I don't think anybody's having these conversations, or we are, but we're having them quietly and painfully and very alone.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate both you, Tashi, and Ben, like those perspectives, because I think it's such an important dynamic for us to be aware of. Because Ben, I think you're right, where as white people, it is our responsibility to see the humanity in the people that did that and do that work, because those are our people. And we also, there's that level of listening and realizing that it's not your job to be able to do that work as a person of color. That's where like that reconciliation and like relationship, where that gets weaponized, where you put someone who is unsafe to the existence of a person of color, or someone who is Jewish or queer, or someone who's disabled. And like, we have literal Nazis, right, that were a part of that coup, that like they want the extermination of people who are different than them. that is not a safe thing, like, to be able to have that, and why white folks need to speak and do that work where, I don't know if, folks on here have seen, but it's very easy to just, like, completely condemn and not also recognize that, like, we have to do that work, because if we don't, who's going to be doing it? It's just going to continue. Like, Reverend Shanika said, the church can be a powerful tool of reconciliation or a powerful tool of perpetration. And it's the same, I think, for white folks, that being able to recognize that, I also like, and I'm not sure if this is helpful and insightful, but Reverend Shanika, when you were talking about the way that people, like, finding that commonality after the coup attempt, I have family that we have incredibly different perspectives. My dad, I tried calling and he didn't answer because he avoids my conversations a lot, but his sister did, and she and I talked, and she was still very supportive of the previous administration, that he's a businessman and draining the swamp and telling it, like, and all of these things were, like, line by line, just prepared. And so what I asked her, I was like, what is going back to normal for you? And her response was, being able to have, like, a safe place to live and, like, be safe, going out with COVID and things like that. And so, I said, so, like, the normal is a safe place to live and, like, access to healthcare and, like, probably having, like, food and things. And she was like, yeah, that's what I mean by normal. And so having that kind of basic, like, that's a place where I'm going to be able to build on that relationship, because it is relationship building. It's really difficult and really hard to stay in relationship with white people that are overtly racist, and to do it in a way where we're also not allowing it to continue. But it is so important for us to do it, because if we don't, what happens is, kids of color, have that harsher impact. People of color are going to have to be dealing with that blowback instead of us. Like, putting ourselves in that situation helps be able to shift that. And I know Tashi and we had talked about that, being able to be prepared, because it's something that I also thought about. I have a friend that organizes down in Arkansas, and she and I talked about that as well, because that was a very real threat. And, like, Reverend Shanika said, there was people in 2016, Octavia Butler wrote a book called The Parable of the Sower in the 1980s that, like, told us that these things were going to be happening, and we just have to listen, especially if it's not something that's from our perspective.
I just wanted to add, like, when you said, like, I don't think a lot of people are having these conversations, I think that's real. I don't think many parents are. Or I remember, when that year Trump was elected, my daughter was at Hawthorne Elementary School, which uses, like, the Circle of Courage model, Ubuntu, like, they have students from every different background. There's pretty much, if you're the white student, you're the minority. But when Trump was elected that year, the next day, counselors had to talk, and basically they couldn't even do schoolwork because their lives were so disrupted by the what ifs and all of those things. And it wasn't until I've had various points throughout my life where I'm like oh my God, like, my skin color, how I look, is a target. And in Sioux Falls, I grew up and I've always felt very protected. I also am a half white myself, and my mom is 6 foot almost, and big blonde hair, blue-eyed lady who's very outspoken. So I also recognize my privilege in having her in my life. But I counted ballots this year, my first time doing so, and there were, like, people circling the buildings honking, and they had, like, those Confederate flags and Trump flags, and I was just like, holy crap, like, this is real. And sometimes I have to step, like, inside that moment, and I'm like, holy crap, because sometimes I'm always like, oh, other people are going through this, but I haven't personally experienced it. And it's not until you do, that's when you, like, realize it's, I guess you get a better perspective when you go through something yourself. But and just thinking of youth and our kids, and, like, having these conversations, because I don't think a lot of people know how parents might feel, and that it's real, that those feelings are real and relevant. But I just wanted to add that.
Thank you, Shar. I really appreciate that. I know, being able to have those kinds of difficult conversations is, one of those things where it's hard because it's work. I think, Reverend Shanika, you had said the work that we need to do towards reconciliation, like it's not just like it's done because we decided we're done. I'm not racist. It's done. Like it's work. It's constant work, constant discomfort of like self-examination. It's not something that's easy to be able to have your kids and to talk to your kids, especially as white kids, and then to have them go out into the world and be socialized with white toxicity, and come back and say things, and you're like, what? Where did this come from? Because that's the system that we're a part of, and we all internalize that system, whether or not we agree with it, and it's constant learning and work, and it's a big part of why we exist as an organization, is just to facilitate those conversations and support people. This year we're working on creating spaces for like one-on-one conversations, so we're able to have that relationship building where if there's something that comes up, if like you're experiencing something that's racist, that you're able to reach out, or if it's something where you did something racist and you're like, oh shit, like you're able to reach out and get support to be accountable for that, because it's not just something that happens, it's us having to do that work, and to do that work together in I love that, the beloved community, in that right relation.
I always tell people, like, when we've talked about, like, and it wasn't me who said it, I think it was like St. John Chrysostom way back in the day, that like churches aren't, the churches are hospitals. They're not someplace where you go if you're perfect. They're not someplace where you go because everything's right. You go there because you need to be healed. And so what I always tell people, that means that the work of healing, that work of reconciliation, whatever that is, that work is not comfortable, right? And so sometimes I think too, people come to church because they just want to hear good music, and they want to be comfortable, and they want to blah, blah, blah. So I was like, if that's why you're there, then go join a country club or something, because that's not what it's about, right? We're there to be healed, and healing is uncomfortable, sometimes painful, and takes time. Just ask anybody who's had their hip replaced or, whatever surgery. And so think about that as we think about how we heal. Know that means stepping into some discomfort, right, at times.
Okay, just giving a little bit of space and silence if anyone else has any questions. I think sometimes, just being able to hold space, and the conversation that we had here, and the seeds that are planted, and the work that's being done. I really appreciate each and every one of you on here. We have incredibly deep gratitude for you, Reverend Shaniqua, for being able to be a part of this conversation, and really just starting off the series and this year, this focus on such a really powerful and inspiring and sparks of curiosity, and like all of the amazing things that you were able to share with us. I deeply appreciate people sharing, and people who just were here and bearing witness to the conversation. That's also something very powerful. Just for upcoming, we are looking at a book club. Like I had said, we are doing the one-on-ones. So if you're curious in that, feel free to reach out on Facebook or via email. And then we are just asking, just being able to invite someone. We had a lot of people that were invited here tonight. Just bring someone to the next conversation. That's going to be in February. We have on the 4th of February, that's going to be the Love and Racism. And that's on our Facebook already. And we're also going to do we try not to put the Zoom information out there because there's been issues with people with Zoom calls. So, we try and send it via email or messenger, and then to the event just shortly before. So that's all the housekeeping stuff. I don't know if there's anyone that has final words, and then if not, Reverend Shanika, I'll let you have the floor for any kind of final thoughts.
I do just want to jump in quick. I think there was a question in the chat that I don't think was directly addressed. It kind of was roundabout, but how do we do that work in terms of, I think it was asked during part of the conversation about doing that work in terms of anti-racism and being white people involved. And what does that mean? I think you kind of touched on a little bit, Julia, with the having conversations, but if there's anything else anyone would like to add, what that work looks like.
I think, like I said, those conversations, staying in relationship. And then one of the things that I think is really powerful for white folks, especially, is to, when there is that level of discomfort of like wanting to just completely reject like what's happening, that flare of ego that comes up, is to like recognize that it's something it's insight, it's information for us to be able to look at like where within us we're still struggling with those things, and that it's okay to struggle, it's okay to be wrong and make mistakes, but being able just to be committed to staying in the community and in those relationships. And sometimes that means having firm boundaries, and not, I think, Tashi, when you were talking, I thought of the people with guns kind of thing, is that, in parenting, like you do the, I'm not going to let you hurt me. I'm not going to let you hit me. I'm not going to let you do that. And like that kind of thing of being able to not be silent and say something where I'm not going to let you say that, I'm not going to let you think that it's okay to deal with your problems this way. So, and we can definitely talk about that more in one-on-one conversations and things like that. So.
I don't know what I was supposed to say, but thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your leadership. I didn't know if I was supposed to say a blessing or something, but please be blessed and do wonderful work, this hard work, this difficult work, but this very important work that can transform our community, transform our hearts, our minds. And remember that when we do that, we will also create that beloved community. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.